Oh, thank you so much for joining us so quickly and for being part of today's webinar. We're in Parramatta on Darug land. My name is Jo Taranto and I'll be facilitating today's webinar and asking the questions, finding out a little bit more from one resident of Sydney to another. So thank you for being part of today's session. I am the founder of Good for the Hood. Good for the Hood is a social enterprise which helps communities unpack complex and often sometimes challenging topics to understand when it comes to environmental sustainability, issues of social cohesion, resilience, and the increasingly complex nature of sometimes wicked environmental problems. So it is wonderful to be part of today's session because what we're talking about, the future of Sydney's water, future of water resilience, water in the face of climate change is exactly the sort of issue that we like to get our teeth stuck into. So thanks for being part of it. I'd like to introduce one of our guest panelists who's also going to be giving us our acknowledgement to country. So please welcome James. Hi, James.
Hey, everyone. Sydney Water and Good for the Hood acknowledge the traditional custodians and their ancestors of the land and waters on which we work, live and learn, and we pay our respects to the elders past and present. First Nations people have a deep connection to water, both freshwater and saltwater. Waterways have always been a significant part, played a significant part of, or a significant role in their lives for gathering places, ceremonies, places to eat and play, and also their travel routes. Landscape features, plants and animals were used as markers to find water. The original custodians of the area now known as Greater Sydney are the Dharawal, Gundungurra, Darkinjung, Darug and Eora nations.
Thank you, James. I'm going to introduce you a little bit more officially in a second, but we are here today, all of us, to dig deeper and understand what purified recycled water is, how it works. Some of you, as I mentioned, may have attended our previous webinar. If you haven't, you can still watch that and it is available to rewatch. But in that session, we learned that Sydney is a growing city and we also are faced with the reality of a changing climate. And if we don't think differently about how we're going to manage our water, we really do face the challenge of potentially running out of water in the future. So in this webinar, we're going to dig deeply into one of the options that's being explored, which is purified recycled water. And we're going to talk about how it works and address some of the questions, concerns, and clarify some of the work that's being done about purified recycled water, or as you will hear it referred to today, PRW. So if you have questions along the way, you can put them in the Q&A. We have not only our wonderful panelists, but we do have Sydney Water staff on standby to answer your questions. We will do our best to get through. We've also received a number of questions prior to the session when you booked your tickets, so we have incorporated those as well. So let me introduce our wonderful guests. You've already heard from James. James Harrington is the Senior Project Manager at Sydney Water. He's been in several roles, but has been part of Sydney Water's purified recycled water journey from an early stage through to now the management of the delivery of the demonstration plant, which you'll be hearing a little bit more about. James, your work is focused on the work at the demonstration plant and applying that to the future of Sydney's water. But you also manage a team which is focused on all of the aspects of purified recycled water, including community engagement. So welcome, James. Thanks for being part of today.
Thank you.
And the other wonderful panelist today is Danielle Francis, who's the Manager of Policy and Strategy at Water Services Association of Australia. Danielle has experience in desalination and recycled water for non-drinking purposes. She's been part of conducting global research on purified recycled water and has some really interesting perspectives globally on what's happening there. A number of international committees and being part of the research, which is a growing body of research globally. Also at Danielle's role at Water Services Association of Australia, I've been told that she's really passionate about good water outcomes and making sure that, when we're planning, that we're considering all the aspects of what really makes a good solution. So thank you so much for being part of today as well, Danielle.
Hello, Jo. Thank you.
So before we begin, we have had an interesting week in Sydney. The news cycle has turned to the topic, which you've probably all seen. It was top story on the news. It was on probably all of our newspapers as well, which is the topic of PFAS. So I thought it would be remiss of me not to at least acknowledge it up front today. And I'm going to go to both you, James and Danielle. Talking about what we've seen in the media, can you tell us a little bit about PFAS in the environment and the levels within our drinking water? I'll start with you, James.
Yep, thank you. And yeah, we're very happy to talk about this and talk about what some of the work done today is. In response to some of the concerns about PFAS, Sydney Water decided to go out and do some extra monitoring to help with some of the concerns about what are the PFAS levels that we're seeing around our network. And some of those results have led to that media in the last couple of days. All of those samples did return well below the Australian drinking water guidelines. So they are within our safe health guidelines for drinking water supplies. Because of that, we're within what the experts would call safe drinking water. So Greater Sydney's water is safe to drink. The testing for it doesn't mean that the presence is an issue. Our guidelines look at chronic and also immediate health risks. Chemical concern is viewed as more of a long-term health risk, and so being below that health guideline means that we're not at risk, and the fact that we know the data means that we are in a good place to manage it. Just pausing for a second. When it comes to these guidelines and how a water system works, there is a bit of a three-way relationship where we have Water New South Wales, who manages the dams, rivers and catchments, New South Wales Health, who oversee the water quality and check that Sydney Water's treatment is reaching the guidelines and the levels that it needs to, and Sydney Water, who does the treatment and supplies the water. So there is quite a good structure around this where those three companies or bodies work together to make sure that we have a safe and reliable system. And that covers more than just PFAS. We look at a whole host of different things to make sure our drinking water meets the Australian drinking water guidelines. But one of the things that we often hear is, where does the PFAS come from? PFAS is in a lot of places in our world. It's found in firefighting foams and things like that. We've all heard about that. But it's also in other items like Tupperware, waterproof clothing, paper coatings, cosmetics, and even sunscreens. And it's worth noting that none of our water treatment actually puts any PFAS into the water. And given we're here today talking about PRW, our process that we would use for PRW and the one that we have out at the Discovery Centre is actually highly efficient at removing PFAS from water through that reverse osmosis step. I might hand over to Danielle about a bit more of the national view though.
Oh, thanks, James. Yeah, so as James said, PFAS is a product that's been around. It's a man-made sort of family of chemicals that were created in about the 1950s or so, and they're used in all sorts of consumer products. So there's, and it's with PFAS, it's really a question of lifetime exposure, and there's multiple pathways basically. So I totally understand that seeing some of the headlines that have been around this week are probably, make people a bit interested and want to know a bit more. So in Australia, as James said, we have the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines. And one of the things that's triggered a bit of interest is that over in America, because a lot of different countries have different standards on this, and over in America, they reduced their standards of what thresholds are allowed to be in drinking water, and they gave the water utilities over there 5 years to implement the changes. And so people are saying, well, what about us? And so that's something, there's a body called the National Health and Medical Research Council that's made up of health experts, and what they're doing is that they review the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines and determine what are the appropriate limits. So they review them. It's ongoing, basically, the review of that, and there is a review of that happening, and they're looking at PFAS, and they're looking at, for example, what happens in America. And as a water sector, we welcome that review. We await to see what the findings of that are, basically. And as a water sector, we will look to to comply with whatever the standards are that they set for Australia. So, you know, it really is a global issue and something that everyone's looking at.
Yeah, thank you so much for both for clarifying. I think it's good to know water is safe, and I think we want people to feel safe with the water that we have, and also acknowledge that, you know, there's always more work to be done potentially, you know, looking at these sorts of big systemic issues. For those people who didn't attend the webinar, James, just so that we go in with the right framing, can you remind us what Greater Sydney is facing when it comes to our water supply and the challenges with a growing city facing climate change?
Happy to. Greater Sydney is a growing and vibrant city. Our population is booming. We're predicted to reach 8 million people in the next 40 years. That population growth means more water, and we need to expand our capacity to supply water. Our existing water sources are pretty much at the point where they're meeting demand, and so we need to look towards the future and ask ourselves, where will this future water come from? But if we also look backwards at the last two droughts, the image which is on the screen, you can see in the last 20 years, we've experienced two quite severe and serious droughts, both of which saw a 50% decline in our catchments. At the moment, we're highly reliant on rainfall, which falls into dams. And what we're seeing over these two droughts is the time that those dams buy, because of their large storages, is reducing from 4 years to 2.5 years. And so we're at that tipping point where we need to start looking towards the future and preparing so that we're ready for that growth and we can service all of our customers into the future.
It's amazing to think that with a city our size, that within a 2-year drought, which we know in Australia is really not a long period of drought. I mean, I grew up in country New South Wales where we'd have, you know, droughts at least that long. You can understand why there's such an urgency to look at options. Can you tell us a bit about the purified recycled water demonstration facility? I understand, I haven't actually been there, but I've heard from a few people who've been out and had a look. There's an education centre, and it's sort of the first of its kind in New South Wales. Danielle, have you been there? And can you tell us a little bit about what purified recycled water is and how it gets created or managed?
Absolutely, and yeah, it's definitely a great place to go and visit if you if you have an interest in water. It's a fantastic experience to go out and see it. Yeah, so what is purified recycled water? Well, basically, when we use water in our homes and businesses, whether it's in a production line in a factory or wash your hands at the sink, from toilets, from showers, from kitchens, all those sources, it goes to what we call a water recycling plant. And there we treat it. But that's just sort of what we call conventional treatment. And the water that comes out of that looks kind of like this. Like, it basically looks clean because it gets really cleaned up by that process. But what we then do with purified recycled water is we take that water that's already pretty clean and we put it through what's called advanced treatment processes. And there's slightly different ones around the world. You know, there's a few different ones that can do it, but they have to meet some very strict standards in terms of the quality of the water that comes out through all of those processes, and very well practiced around the world. And it has to meet the guidelines within Australia, the guidelines of water recycling, to be ready to use to be able to supplement drinking water source. And it's something that's actually been practiced for a long time around the world. It's been going since the 1960s in America and in Africa, and it's actually happening in a lot of places. People probably actually don't realise how much it's being used. But that's what the purified recycled water is. It's really, really, really high grade water.
And how did you find yourself working with purified recycled water? It feels like, you know, you've had a lot of experience in this. Is it something, like you said, that just a lot of countries are doing, so therefore you've had exposure to, Danielle?
Look, certainly. I mean, here in Australia, we're really mindful of water because it's something that, you know, it's a bit scarce for us. And something that we do at WASA is we're always looking out and saying, well, what are other people doing in other parts of the world? What are best practices in terms of water? And what we've noticed is that, like most places, Australia has typically relied on rivers and dams to be our sources of water, and that's very much like everywhere else too. But we've noticed that they can be a bit, if you have a drought, for example, or a flood, that can pose problems. And so what we've seen is that around the world, a lot of places are adopting these, what we call rainfall independent sources of water. And when we started to look at purified recycled water, I was actually amazed at how many places are already doing it. So there's already over 35 cities globally across many different continents that have adopted this and are using it as part of their water supply. and a lot of them have actually been doing it for decades. Some really well-known ones in Africa, some like in Namibia, Singapore, a lot of places in the US are doing it. And people probably don't even realize that because they just sort of, it's kind of just part of the water supply. And Perth is doing it as well. Perth has a groundwater replenishment scheme that's been going for a number of years now and recently doubled. And so definitely what we've found is that it's actually far more widely practiced than perhaps most of us realize. And, you know, it's a great way of increasing the resilience of water supplies and complementing those what we call traditional sources of supply with sources that are more rainfall independent, and they're going to help us as we go into the future with population growth, climate change and droughts and floods and so on.
Yeah, great. So I guess we want to know if people have travelled to a city which has purified recycled water, and whether they know. I know now. After you said, yeah, after you just mentioned a couple, I clearly have, but I didn't know it at the time.
If you've been to Los Angeles, if you've been to Orange County, if you've been to Disneyland in Anaheim and drank the water there, then you've had that water too. If you've ever been to Windhoek in Namibia, if you've been to Singapore, if you've been fairly recently to certain parts of Manila in the Philippines, there's a lot of different places in England that are already doing it, and other parts of the world as well, places in Texas.
Fantastic. Well, I'm just running a poll now, and it's looking interesting. I think some people may have answered the question before they've heard all that list, but I'm going to share this now with everyone so they can see that just over half think that they've been to a country or a city, sorry, that's has purified recycled water in their water supply. So we're going to share a little bit of a map. I understand, Danielle, that you've been working off. Tell us a little bit about how many countries are already, or cities and countries are using purified recycled water, and how many are looking at it as well.
Well, there's some new maps that will come out soon. We know that there's about 35 or so cities globally that have already adopted it. So they've already got it in place. But then there's about sort of 50 or so more that are looking at it. And some of them are at the kind of early stages where they're just saying, hey, this is an option. We've seen that this is getting really adopted and it's a really safe and sustainable and reliable way of doing it. So they're just kind of exploring it. Whereas some others are further along, like they've decided to do it, but they might still be in the planning or the construction phases and they haven't turned it on yet. But there's a lot of places that are doing it, and it has really grown quite a lot from back in the 60s when there was a place in California and a place in Africa. Over the decades, it has really augmented a lot. And it is something that we'll definitely see a lot more of in future. And it's interesting to note, for example, probably here in Sydney, I imagine many people are perhaps more familiar with desalination because we have the desalination plant at Fernell, and that's proved a really reliable part of our water supply. But you know, in other parts of the world, it hasn't always been desalination that's come first. For example, if you look at California, there's a couple of dozen places that are either already using purified recycled water or are exploring it for the future, supplying millions of people, whereas there are hardly any desalination plans. If you look at Cape Town's water strategy for the future, some of you might remember 2018 when Cape Town was counting towards day zero. Their water strategy, they're looking to implement purified recycled water before they would look at desalination. So, you know, there's not always a uniform way these things are approached around the world, but both those options are in use quite a lot.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And you mentioned that it's being used in Australia as well. So it's not just Sydney's not the only city that's looking at this. James, can you tell us a bit more about why Sydney Water is looking at purified recycled water as an option? I mean, we heard about what's happening with our dams and rainfall dependence. What does purified recycled water solve?
PRW is really a huge opportunity for us to make the most of the natural resources that we have. Firstly, it's a rainfall independent supply, or mostly rainfall independent. When it rains, there's plenty of water. However, if we can bring that water back in and start to recycle it and take that pressure off our rainfall and our dams, that means that we've got a more reliable, abundant source of water, which continues to flow. There will always be water in the wastewater system. And so tapping into that means that we can get more use out of our water, which sadly at the moment, most of it is used once and then goes back out to the ocean, and we're reliant on that rainfall cycle to bring it back. But also, PRW leverages the existing treatment plants and existing assets that we already have. So our water resource recovery facilities, or what we used to call waste or sewage treatment plants, they're already in place and they're already treating to a reasonably high standard. So using those assets and taking them to that next stage or advanced treatment stage, as Danielle says, gets the most out of what these plants can provide. But also the fact that we can build a purified recycled water plant in Western Sydney, where that water is used in that area and normally discharged right out towards the coast, we can interrupt that flow and be able to, the lights have just gone out here. We can interrupt that flow and get better use out of the water by bringing in that circular economy, bring it back into the top of our water system so that we're not using it once and sending it out to the ocean.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, when you start to unpack of how we manage water, I guess in every city, but in Australia being such a very dry continent, it does seem a little bit like we are hoping that it comes back to us, but we're not always sure when or how much. So yeah, it definitely feels like it gives us more control if we have that capability. So one of the things that people ask about, obviously, and we've already heard it being talked about, is PFAS. But what else do people want to know when it comes to purified recycled water and being in our drinking water?
Of course. And a lot of these questions are very valid. People like me sit here thinking about this all day, every day. The most common questions we get are the removal of drugs, hormones, PFAS, things that are top of mind for our community. It is important to know that when we talk about PRW, we call it triple treated. That means 3 plants. So we've got our water resource recovery facility, and then we come to an advanced treatment plant or PRW plant. The water that comes out of the wastewater plant would normally go to the river, so it's already quite a high standard. When we bring it into the PRW plant, we put it through 3 primary treatment steps and then disinfection afterwards. So we have ultrafiltration. Ultrafiltration is really good at removing things that are suspended in the water, so little bits of plants, and goes down to the level where it starts to remove some viruses and bacteria from the water. After that, we go to the next level of filtration, which is reverse osmosis. For those who are a little bit more technological and get interested in a lot of these stuff, that's the same process that you would see in a desalination plant. Reverse osmosis pulls almost everything out of the water. It is so high level that it starts to pull things like salts out. If you remember back to your high school chemistry, a salt's pretty small. So when we're starting to talk about removal to that level, the water is incredibly clear. But at this point, we've exhausted how much physical treatment or physical filtration we can do. And so we start moving towards chemical and chemistry treatments. So we use advanced oxidation with a UV light. So what we do there is kind of like the old days of camping. When you're disinfecting water, you put a UV light in it. That kills off any viruses and bacteria. But here we're taking it to another level. We also add in an advanced oxidant. That advanced oxidant, when it's in contact with that UV light, it breaks down into something that's quite reactive. And what that does is it reacts with anything else that's in the water. So anything like your drugs, one of the most common that we have to check for is caffeine. If that's made it through the previous 2 steps, that oxidant reacts with it and breaks it down to its constituent parts, the smallest parts of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and renders them totally harmless. So this treatment train is incredibly high level treatment. And then after that, we always make sure, as with pretty much all of our treatment plants, whether they're water or wastewater, we also chlorinate it to make sure that any residual viruses or bacteria that can cause you to become sick quite quickly are killed off. When we're talking about this, it is a 4-step process. Each one of them reinforces the other. And having that multiple barrier approach where we do a lot of testing and we make sure that when we go through one step, we make sure that we're hitting the level of treatment that we need before taking it to the next. That means that if there is any variability in the treatment train, we actually have a bit of redundancy throughout the plant so that we are entirely confident in ourselves that the water that we produce is safe. The majority of our treatment happens within that second stage, that reverse osmosis. That's really where we see a lot of the items or contaminants that people are concerned about. The most common ones being things like the pill, illicit drugs, hormones, And then we start to get towards the virus, bacteria, and the newer ones like microplastics and PFAS. Reverse osmosis is incredibly good at removing these contaminants from the water, but we also have those additional steps. But a really important part of creating PRW is the safety controls and the protocols around it. Because we're going to what we would call advanced treatment, we have a lot of critical control points. A critical control point is pretty much a non-negotiable when we're operating. So if the water is to progress from one unit to the next, we have to meet certain testing parameters. And that is to ensure that each unit is operating to the level that we would need for it to be deemed safe, or that it has removed enough from the water that we are comfortable. Only once we've had all of those green ticks would we ever talk about calling that clean PRW. Once it's done though, Sydney Water is talking about not just calling it it's clean water, we're talking about putting it back into a river, a dam, or a catchment so they can supplement our raw water or dam water and then be extracted out to another treatment plant at the filtration plant that serves our drinking water supplies.
Yeah, fantastic. It's so interesting to think about all the things that are probably in water that I've never thought about. And one being caffeine is fascinating to me. I can tell you there would be lots of caffeine around my house. I want to know, Danielle, have you tasted purified recycled water, and what does it taste like?
I don't know if they can see that. I've got some samples from around the world here. That's from Orange County in California, some Singapore, and even got that's some beer. The Singaporeans, as a bit of a way of helping people understand it, they made some beer with the purified recycled water as well. Yes, I have tasted it. I mean, it tastes like water, and it's funny when you look at some other cities that are going through a process like building a demonstration plant and talking to their communities about it too. They'll often produce that samples, and a lot of them they'll have videos of people who will say it tastes like water. They always say it tastes like water, and that's because it is water. It's water.
So can we try it out at the Quakers Hill demonstration facility yet, James?
So we've only just opened the plant, and like all plants, that once they're turned on, they have to go through a period of testing. And so that unfortunately means we can't taste it right now. We are hopeful that once we've been through the full testing process and have that data to show that the water is incredibly pure, that at that point we would be allowed to taste it.
Right. Well, I've got one more big question, and then I'm going to move to some really quick questions for both of you, because we've got a lot of things that we want to cover, a lot of questions coming in through the Q&A. So make sure if you haven't got yours in there yet that you do. But I just want to know why this option makes Greater Sydney more resilient. James, is it because it's just removing our dependence on rainfall, but is there also other environmental benefits? I mean, is it desirable for other reasons that, someone who's interested in sustainability like me would be excited about?
Yeah, I might just start with where we are at the moment. Currently, Greater Sydney's reliance on dam water is huge. 80% of our water that we use gets used once and then is discharged out into the ocean. And as you were saying previously, we're currently kind of hoping that the rainfall patterns keep topping up our dams and making sure that we have sufficient raw water or dam water to provide that water supply. So if we're going down a very linear process, we're not bringing in that circular economy and making the most out of the natural resources. That wastewater, which is collected all throughout Sydney and then discharged out into the ocean, goes about 2 or 3 kilometres offshore. That does mean that there is a very high level of dilution, and we do a lot of monitoring work around those areas. But if we're talking about 80% of our water that is used and then gets discharged directly out into the ocean, if we can start bringing that circular economy, stop that discharge, reduce it down, and start making better use of that water, that allows us to make the most out of a natural asset. Yes, we're less reliant on rainfall, but our water is actually full of resources. So at Sydney Water, we also harvest biosolids, we provide recycled water. And so why would we not then look to bring in circular economy principles to the fact that we can get the drinking water back out of what we've used once, but also the best outcome for us is a mixed or all options supply. But PRW has different levers, different benefits compared to some of the others. So it has definitely huge environmental improvements where we can stop that one-way flow. It also uses a third less energy than desalination. It also, because of the location of the waters being used, it can be built on the western side of Sydney, which means we don't then have to pump desalination water from the coast right up to the hill to make sure that everyone who's using it gets the water. But then the last part is that it also has a huge opportunity that we can treat that wastewater and we can use it without having to burden our natural environment with the flows that we create in Western Sydney or discharge it out to the environment. So we get an environmental benefit out of treating that water to a high level and then really taking that strain off dams and the natural riverways.
Right. Thanks, James. I've got a couple of some really specific PRW treatment questions, which I'm going to throw to you in a second, which will be great. So thank you for all those fantastic questions. And I think I'm pretty good with the acronyms, but I'll see how I go. But I am going to ask our quick fire questions because I think they will spur some more questions on and then throw those other questions to you. So nice and quick, Danielle, James, you don't have to go deep, but just give us maybe the Twitter answer or the X answer now, just 25 words or less. Why don't we just build more dams, James?
We already have 11 dams, which is quite surprising to most people, and they provide 85% or more of our water supply. For us to build new dams of any size, which would create any big benefits of the water supply, it's very expensive and it has a huge environmental toll.
Great. You did very well there. I know they're not easy to answer quickly. Why don't we do more desalination?
Desal or desalination, sorry, I'm getting into my acronyms too, is a great option for water supply. We've already got the Sydney desalination plant and we would look to increase the amount of that supply to support our drinking water system. But it is expensive to run. It has a lot of salt that it needs to pull out of the water, plus it needs to pump up the hill. But desal is definitely part of our core strategy moving forward of boosting that amount of water supply, which isn't dependent on rain.
And Danielle?
I was just going to say, when you talk to the water community around the world, sometimes we fixate on should it be this option or that option. In reality, we are going to need all these options. They are all going to be really important. The whole suite of tools in our toolkit are going to be important as we move forward into the future.
Nothing's off the table. I like it. We always get this question. I always have this conversation with people. They just think that surely we can just do better recycling at home and better water conservation. Can we just recycle more at home and conserve more at home? And would this solve the issue?
So I'm happy to have a go.
We already do some water recycling. We provide recycled water to homes in certain areas, which is provided through a secondary pipe or purple pipe, we would often call it. And that's great for things like watering gardens and things like that. But it is very expensive to put into non-new areas. So digging up streets to put in that pipe. But also our community has already done a fantastic job of reducing water demand. Since the Millennium Drought, our community has made water conservation a really common practice. Danielle, you probably have a bit more to add on that.
Yeah, definitely. Look, and often people do think, can't we just sort of recycle more? The challenge with non-drinking recycling or recycling for non-drinking purposes is that you can only use it for a really small amount of purposes because that water is not treated up to that drinking water standard. The economies of scale that you get from treating it up to drinking water standard means you can use it for everything that you use tap water for now. And so it actually ends up being far more cost effective and typically more cost effective than the other options out there.
Yeah, fantastic. And we are actually doing pretty well with conservation, which I was surprised to hear, James and Danielle. Can't we just save more water at home? We do okay. Is that right?
Yeah. As our population's grown, we've actually seen that often our water stays the same. Our water demand stays the same. And that's really thanks to water conservation is just a part of life for Australians, and that's really given us time to the point where we're at now, where we haven't needed to do significant investments since Warragamba Dam and Sydney desalination.
And we often hear this question too, Danielle, why don't we use stormwater? Stormwater. It's, we've got lots of it. It floods things. Why can't we use it?
So we can, and again, like it's an option that can be really valuable. But the challenge is with stormwater, typically when there's storms is when it's raining. But typically when you're in a drought period, there's not as many storms. So you're not getting that rainfall when you need it. And the other challenge is you can have a really, really, really big dump of rain in a really specific location. You've got to have somewhere to store it. And in a big built city like Sydney, you just don't have these enormous spaces that you need to build to receive and store that water. Plus, from a water industry perspective, it's actually far better for us to treat recycled water because we know the quality of it and we know the quantity of it, and it's very reliable. And it actually makes it a far safer and more cost-effective option for us as an industry as to how we can better treat it.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you for that. We're going to quickly look at some of the common questions that come up and then dive into some of the more technical questions. So Sydney Water's reportedly done quite a bit of research and unpacking what people see as the barriers and understanding around purified recycled water. Danielle, what do you say to people who say it's not natural to treat water that's been used, like that this is an unnatural process and that it's, not trustworthy because of that?
Well, as a matter of fact, if you look at the natural water cycle, like if you think back to, my kids at school, what they're learning about the natural water cycle is that water gets used and rains, gets used, go down through rivers and evaporates and goes through the cycle again. So what's happening in the natural water cycle, what we're doing with something like PRW, it's actually doing exactly what happens in the natural water cycle, but it's doing it more quickly and speeding it up. So it's actually based on nature. It's actually doing exactly what happens in Mother Nature does anyway.
Yeah. And we've got quite a few questions in the Q&A, and also you've received these questions before, Sydney Water, about cost. James, how does purified recycled water compare cost-wise in terms of infrastructure, impact on, residential water bills? Is it going to make everything more expensive? Is it an expensive option?
Look, all new water infrastructure is going to cost money. And as we've talked about, we're at a bit of a tipping point where we need to start acting. Purified recycled water, because it does avoid investment that we would need to make in our wastewater plants through taking some of the load off those assets, which take them to the wastewater to the coast, actually has some cost savings, which is always ironic to say when you're talking about building something. But being able to leverage those, the existing assets and avoid new assets, we actually get a very competitive or low cost option. Its lower energy cost also means it's a bit more efficient to run, but also dam water will always be the cheapest water. We, in our operation, always make choices to make sure that we are supplying the cheapest source of water, but then desalination is amazing in times of drought to provide a large volume of water, but it's one that we would like to sort of turn on or turn up as we need it more than have running all the time.
All right, I think we've reached that point of the webinar where I want to focus in on the questions that are coming in. And a good way to probably start is to lean into talking about the process a little bit more, James, but particularly because so many of the questions are focused on that. One of the questions we received at the registration was, can we purify wastewater instead of recycling it first and then purifying it? I don't know if that question makes sense to you, but can we purify wastewater instead of recycling it, then purifying it? I think it's sort of...
So, yeah, I think I understand where the question's leading to. So we always need to put it through the wastewater plant. So the wastewater plant generally does produce to that level where it would be called recycled water. And the important thing is that plant is a little bit differently focused. It starts to remove out solids, then it starts to remove nitrogen and phosphorus, the nutrients within the water, before filtration. That makes it quite safe and quite a good source of water for rivers or non-drinking sources, so once it's been chlorinated or gone through a UV disinfection, that's recycled water. That step still needs to happen. And then the advanced treatment needs to follow, because that advanced treatment, if we took wastewater straight into that plant, it would clog the filters and we wouldn't actually get much water out of it. So it is important that we go through that sort of recycled phase through that wastewater plant and then go to the advanced treatment stage.
Right. Now, I'm assuming, James, there's more than one way to purify recycled water. I could be wrong. But why was reverse osmosis chosen as part of that process? Is that a decision that has to be made? Is it the only choice? And what's behind the use of that technology? That's one of our questions.
Yeah, so there are two very common treatment trains that are around at the moment. The first one is the filtration treatment train, and that's what we have opted for. The main reason that we went for that is because we are a coastal city and we have those ocean discharges. It's quite efficient and effective to be able to leverage those discharges so that you can create the brine out of the reverse osmosis system and then send that out to the coast. The other treatment train is a carbon-based train. That uses 2 stages of carbon to trap all the contaminants in that. That's a little bit newer compared to other places in the world, but we really made our decision because we have that capability to deal with the brine quite effectively. And when we're talking about purified recycled water, normally it's in an inland plant. And so having RO level water or RO quality water means that we can continue to discharge that out to our rivers and streams. And that water is so clean that it actually helps clean up those rivers and provides an environmental benefit as well.
Super technical question from John. Love it. How much waste, such as ultrafiltration backwash and reverse osmosis brine, is generated? So what's the percentage of recovery of that waste and where does it go?
Yeah, so when we're talking about this, for ultrafiltration, we are going to see if we can return it back to the head of the wastewater plant works so that we can try and eliminate that wastage. Typically, they would normally operate at sort of 90 to 95% water recovery. Our reverse osmosis in the Discovery Centre operates at 83%. That's a very high recovery when we're talking about reverse osmosis. And that really comes from the fact that the water that we're feeding in doesn't have too much salt in it. And so that means we're really able to get a lot of the water out that we put in, and the remainder would be of that 17% would be the water which is in the brine stream going out to the ocean.
So this might be a question for you, Danielle, as well. Obviously, it's a bit specific to Sydney, but what kind of ecological impacts about the discharge are there if purified recycled water, you've just mentioned that there's probably more positive than negative, James. Is that what you generally see? I don't know, Danielle, if you want to answer, or James, but is there testing of that water and the impact of discharging this water back into our waterways?
I might pick that one up, Danielle. So if we are discharging from the plant to a river or a dam or things like that, the water is actually very, very clean. It has very low nutrients, which means it's unlikely that the river or stream is going to start growing algae is the primary concern. And because we're doing so much testing, we know that a lot of the things which have come into the wastewater plant, we have removed, and we confirm that over and over again. So that water is kind of pretty much as clean as you can get. Just remembering that all water has contaminants in it, whether it's from a dam or anywhere else. But I also think the question is also about the brine stream, which gets discharged out into the ocean. There's been quite a lot of work being done, especially around the Sydney desalination plant, to monitor and test for the water health and especially the ecological health around those brine discharge. The main principle that's at play here is dilution. So a small amount of water goes into the ocean. It's diluted within about 50 metres of the area. And we've actually seen quite good results where there may be some evidence that the ecology within the close area is actually starting to thrive because of that that brine discharge creates a different type of ecosystem which supports some species.
And so the other question there is also about discharge, but of the other kind, I imagine. I imagine this discharge is, oh, I'll ask you and you can tell me, James, is purified recycled water remineralized before discharge? I believe it's remineralized for drinking as well. Maybe that's a question.
Yes. Remineralization is an important part of any reverse osmosis plant. First of all, it helps us protect our assets. If we don't remineralize, it can start to pull minerals out of the concrete. So when we're at full scale, we definitely will be putting remineralization. And the important thing for us drinking is we're adding calcium back into it. And that calcium within the water creates, it sort of almost calms the water down a bit. And so the water's not trying to react with things, because when water's very clean, it starts to look for those minerals wherever it can get it. And so it is an advisable target within the guidelines that you remineralize and add a certain amount of calcium.
I'm going to have some of the most deep, sort of remineralized skin that I've ever seen if I start washing my face with super clean water. It's fascinating, isn't it, really, to think that we actually need those minerals. I believe it changes the taste as well, Danielle.
Yes.
You don't have minerals in.
And just like for a non-chemistry person like me, this all sounds very technical, but what we're basically doing when we remineralize it, when you put it through an RO type process, you are making the water so pure that it doesn't even have any minerals left in it. But water, when you take it from the environment, from all different sources, has minerals in it, from being in the environment, rocks and stuff. So the reason that you remineralize it is to make it back like normal water. And it's all, no matter where the water comes from, and no matter the different sort of filtration processes and so on, it all has to meet the Australian drinking water guidelines. So you're bringing that back to standard, normal tap water quality by doing that. It's the normal thing to do.
And Lyndall has a question then to Danielle, possibly for you, that, people who have water filters in their home and who swear by them, do you think they're worthwhile, and do you use one?
Well, no, I don't use one, because the water industry filters water too. Like water that comes out of your tap is filtered at water filtration plants. So, we might sort of forget about that because it's sort of a bit further back up the chain from our house, but it is already filtered when it brings to you. So no, typically we don't believe that there's a need to have a water filter, but some people, like to use them for taste or a personal preference or whatever. I mean, that's your prerogative, but no, I don't.
I've got a very smug friend who swears that their water is superior. I'm yet to notice the difference, but I always smile and say, oh, it's lovely. So, I think it's a thing, but, not essential. If you want to do it, great.
Often a water filter might use reverse osmosis. There's something like the demonstration the process is there. It's doing what a filter does. It's just the same process at a larger scale.
Yeah, great. So I want to just ask a few questions now about consultation, about engagement, about awareness, because someone's rightly indicated this is a change for Sydney. It's certainly new for a lot of people. It's maybe a bit kind of eye-opening. It might be a bit scary. What is the process, maybe for you, James, because your team's been doing a lot of early stage discussions. How do you approach that change management piece? And, how do you reach people from all different communities, all different cultural backgrounds? How do you have those conversations and make people aware? And is it something that the community get a say in?
That is a great question. And really, a lot of my time is devoted to how we plan this out. Sydney Water's got a couple of different approaches to this. We've got our education team who does a fantastic job of going out into communities. They go to places like school. First of all, teaching what the water cycle is and where our drinking water comes from, because that's the fundamentals for us to explain what the challenges are in our water system. We have to start at basics. We've seen that some people are not confident in identifying the natural water cycle. And so that education piece for us is very important to help talk about what we are proposing and the challenges of a rainfall dependent system. But now we're starting to shift gears. We're starting to talk about our proposal to implement purified recycled water. So what that means is a bit more direct conversation about things like this, having discussions about what is purified recycled water, what is the benefits associated with it. So parts of my team are out in the community. Just on the weekend, we're at Blacktown, Flavors of Blacktown markets, because we do want to discuss with the community. We understand this is new. People in the water industry can sometimes forget that we spend all day thinking about this, but for the majority of our customers and our community, you turn the tap on and there's not much thought about what has been done to it beforehand. And so hearing what are the concerns and being able to respond to them, especially very valid things like, as we started, PFAS, hormones, things that they know are in the water. They want to hear from us about how do we feel confident, and do we ourselves as Sydney Water employees feel confident that we are treating that out. And so that's a really important thing to us, that we are out in community, and we're going to continue that conversation for a very long time. This isn't a short-term burst for us. This is a long-term conversation that we would like to have. But this is open for discussion. So we are going through the EIS process. Some people may have seen our scoping report, which is up on the government portal for major infrastructure. And that really provides a very good platform for people to put in official submissions of what are their views, what are their concerns. And this isn't a foregone conclusion. We really do want to hear what the concerns are, because it's important to us that we can have an informed discussion and make the decision from that point. We also have to go through approvals processes ourselves, be it with New South Wales Health, the EIS process, and government approvals after that too.
I think there was a question here. Someone said, I don't think it's relevant, but I'll ask anyway. I think it's actually a great question, because I think it highlights the challenge for the water industry and even, a whole bunch of other community facing issues, is that what control do you have about what goes into water? I mean, in terms of things like plastics and pesticides and PFAS, water obviously is the great leveler in terms of where things end up. Chemicals, drugs, COVID, we heard all these, it's a great marker for all the things that are impacting human health or a side effect of living with water. With Danielle, maybe this is one for you. What control does Sydney Water have of that, or a water utility have, or do they just have to respond to the system as it is and, manage so that it is meeting the guidelines?
So can I answer that by saying, yes, water is we often are the legacy. We often kind of inherit things that are created back up in supply chains, in consumer product world and things like that. And people don't think about it like when they turn on the tap or take out the plug from the sink or flush the toilet or whatever. We do inherit those things. But what I will say is, people, honestly, you'll be amazed if you hear the amount of science and consideration and regulation and monitoring and things like that go on behind the scenes of the water sector. And people don't think about it that much, because it's not like consumer products like, soft drink or whatever. People just kind of, it's not top of mind to think about water. You just turn on the tap and then it's there. But there are all sorts of processes in place that help to manage those things. And that includes source control, which is upstream. And that includes things like, there's a huge amount of regulation around what people are allowed to discharge into waterways like rivers and things like that. There's a huge amount of source control regulation around what people are allowed to discharge from their businesses, like businesses, restaurants that make different manufacturing processes and things like that. That's all very quite heavily regulated in terms of all those things to kind of keep it out of the water. And also, even then, when you then get water into plants, those plants are designed to help you take out things that can be present in the water, so that the water that gets produced is fit for purpose, basically, whether for drinking water or, sometimes the water might get discharged to the environment or whatever that is. So it's quite heavily regulated. And there's a lot of people out there thinking about those things all the time and working on monitoring it and implementing.
Great. I got two more questions for you, James, and then probably one more for you. Well, maybe one more for you, Danielle, I think, because I know we're right at the end. And thank you for all the amazing questions. There's been like 30 questions that the Sydney Water team have been busy answering, as well as our panelists. It's not the last chance for sharing your questions, your feedback. We're going to take a couple of polls in a second. I'm going to give you some information about where you can contact Sydney Water as well. But the question I had is, are the standards for purified recycled water stricter than they are for desalination, James? And I've got a second question, but I might let you answer that one as well.
No worries. So there is a couple of different guidelines that come into play here. The desalination plant needs to meet the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines at the moment the water leaves the plant. The difference there to purified recycled water is we're talking about returning it to the natural environment in our dams and rivers to later be extracted for drinking water. Despite the fact the process is the exact same, we have to meet the Australian Guidelines for Water Recycling Phase 2, a very wordy way of saying we have a different quality set for that water to go into dams, rivers, reservoirs to later be extracted for drinking water. At the point where the water leaves that drinking water plant, it must meet the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines. So regardless, the water will meet the same standards. It's just whether there is an extra step in there. But the water is incredibly high quality from both plants.
Fantastic. Would you expect, James, the further treatment of brine for things like PFAS would be required as a purified recycled water demand grows? Like, are we going to need greater changes as, you know, if purified recycled water is adopted more broadly? Is that going to change what the treatment process would be for Sydney?
It's unlikely to change the treatment process. When we're talking about these contaminants like PFAS and microplastics, we're more likely to look towards source control and controlling it before it comes into us. Further treatment of brine is something that the industry is looking into, and especially led by areas like the mining sector, treating their wastewater streams to try and get more back out of it. But it's not something that we're likely to have to change our treatment process at this stage to accommodate.
I'm just launching a poll right now while we're talking about our final questions, because I know people are going to have to bounce off. So if you could, hopefully this question's working. Maybe it's not because no one's answered it yet. Oh, yep. Excellent. Good. So if you can give us any feedback on the session, I'll just leave that running while we have our final two questions. Oh, yes, there's some questions there. I think the Sydney Water can answer around where to find more information on the guidelines. Danielle, is there a standard amount of time globally or a guideline about how long purified recycled water should stay in like a detention, like in a dam, for example, if it's discharged to Prospect Reservoir? Is there a guideline for how long it should stay out there? Is there a standard? I know that's very specific to Sydney, but
no, that is part of the mix of what the health authorities look at when they look at a scheme, but they look at a total thing. It's not like there's binary that it has to be more than X minutes or X hours or X days above or below. What they look at is the entirety of the treatment process. And if it has a long detention time, it actually might not need quite as rigorous steps like in the filtration process. Whereas if it's a short detention time, it might need to have more steps in the process because there's not as much redundancy built into that process of storage time. So it does depend. So different places around the world, some have a number of days, and it can vary depending on the locational guidance too. But it also depends. They look at things like the capacity of the holding reservoir, and also like they even monitor like the movement of water and like, you know, where it kind of flows and how quickly it's going to mix and dilute and things like that as well.
Fantastic. Well, I'm going to share a final slide now, which will give everyone some further information or some further places to go if they're looking for information. Make sure that if you haven't yet given us some feedback via the poll question, I've got one more to go at the end as well. So if you could just hold on for another minute. But I have one more quick question. Maybe this is a really short answer from both you, Danielle and James. Do you think that there's still space for appliances which recycle water at home, like downstream solutions? We still need to do our part at home. Is it important to look at those, and should residents be thinking about that when they're building a new home or retrofitting a solution if they can?
They're really good. And again, it comes to this thing that we need all of these tools in our toolkit. Those things are great. What I would say, because we look at this at a sector-wide scale, they're typically not going to be enough on their own to obviate the need for a large-scale solution at a city level. You know, to meet the demand and supply gap, most cities are going to need to do something city scale to be able to meet that. But all those things are great and they all make a great contribution. Sometimes it's easier than others depending on, your property and things like that, but they can all absolutely play a great role.
Fantastic. I'm going to end this poll quickly. Thanks to those who were able to pick up. I want to ask one more question, which really is, how comfortable would you be if purified recycled water was added to our water supply in Sydney, maybe after talking today? And I want to thank everyone for your participation. I know that I've learned a lot, or it's fascinating that I can think I've got a pretty good understanding of issues, but having experts to talk to always helps. And I'm going to think about a lot of the things we've heard today. It is really topical to be talking about this right now. There is a lot of media, so lean in. I say, get the information, find out more. If you haven't, if you've got a colleague, a friend, family member who would like to join our next session, we have a replicated version of today on next week. So we would love to see you. If you've registered for today, you'll probably get reminded about it. But obviously, if you've already attended, great. But we'd love to see as many people as possible at the next one as well. But I want to thank you. If you haven't yet visited the Purified Recycled Water Discovery Centre at Quakers Hill, it is open. You can go and book a tour. And if you want to ask a very specific question, or if you've got follow-up questions after today, please email prw@sydneywater.com.au. I want to thank you, James and Danielle. I know you've been very busy. It's a very busy time. Lots of media inquiries, lots of questions, lots of things going on. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have a chat today.
Me too. It's been great.
Yes.
Thank you.
Excellent. We'll be sending this recording out. Thank you for your time and interest today. And we look forward to seeing you at future events. Thanks for having me. I'm Jo Taranto, and we'll see you again soon.